It began in darkness, not the quiet darkness of sleep, but the heavy darkness that follows fire. Out of that blackness came the hiss of steam, the clang of steel, the endless roar of machinery that seemed less like the work of men and more like the breathing of some vast mechanical beast. In Detroit, at the River Rouge plant, men worked beneath rafters that vanished into smoke, where sparks fell like orange rain and the floor shook with the pounding of presses. Here metal was melted, hammered, shaped, and reborn as engines, tanks, guns, and ships. To stand within that place was to feel that war had already arrived, though no bombs had fallen on American soil. In the shadows of the plant, a man stood apart from the workers. He wore no uniform and carried no tool. In his hands was only a notebook. He was a visitor, an observer, his face ordinary, his presence easily forgotten. But his eyes caught every detail. He wrote down the dimensions of the furnaces, the speed of the assembly lines, the staggering number of engines produced in a single day. He saw trucks rolling off one line while, in another corner of the factory, the skeletons of aircraft took shape. He recorded how a single city seemed to breathe metal, and how its breath could fill the lungs of an entire war machine. His name would not be remembered in history books, but his words traveled across the Pacific, carried in the pouches of couriers and the codes of telegrams. He was a Japanese intelligence officer, and what he saw in America in 1940 was enough to chill the blood of even the most hardened military men in Tokyo. The report was clinical. It spoke of steel tonnage, of automobiles counted not in hundreds but in millions, of oil reserves that dwarfed anything in Asia, of aircraft factories that promised to turn out planes faster than Japan could hope to build them. But beneath the statistics lay an unspoken truth. America was not a country in the ordinary sense. It was a foundry, a giant workshop, a machine capable of outproducing entire empires. In Tokyo, the files were read in rooms hazy with cigarette smoke, by men in crisp uniforms who ruled an empire that stretched across much of Asia. They studied the numbers in silence. The Imperial Army and Navy were already planning expansion into Southeast Asia, already pushing deeper into China, already dreaming of an empire of resources and power. Yet these reports suggested a future in which all their conquests would be swallowed by a single adversary. One officer is said to have murmured that America could drown Japan in steel before the first year of war was done. Another whispered that the empire's fleet of aircraft carriers, its proudest creation, might one day be matched and surpassed by American shipyards that could launch vessels faster than Japan could replace them. And yet the reports were pushed aside. Pride, necessity, and the belief in spirit over matter blinded the leadership. They told themselves that Americans were soft, that statistics did not measure courage, that Japan's destiny could not be halted by machines. They said the will to fight, the hunger for sacrifice, the honor of the warrior would outweigh the lifeless efficiency of factories. It was a convenient illusion, and it was one the empire desperately needed to believe. For to accept the reports as truth was to admit that war with the United States was unwinnable before it even began. Before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, before the rising sun flag was raised across half the Pacific, Japanese intelligence had already revealed the true balance of power. America's industrial heartland was vast, stretching from Pittsburgh to Chicago, from Detroit to the shipyards of the coasts. In those cities, steel was forged in rivers of fire, automobiles rolled out of plants by the tens of thousands each week, and oil flowed from fields that seemed endless. The Great Depression had scarred America, but it had not destroyed its foundations. Behind the silence of isolation, the United States remained a giant whose hands could shape the outcome of the modern world. The man in Detroit was not the only one. Japanese agents traveled through other cities, sometimes openly, sometimes in secrecy. They visited shipyards where keels of battleships lay like iron skeletons waiting to rise. They walked through airfields where prototypes of bombers gleamed in the sun. They wrote of railroads stretching like veins across a continent, carrying coal, iron, oil, and men without pause. They marveled at the highways and at the endless fields of wheat and corn, at the simple fact that America could feed itself while fighting a war, and still send food abroad to its allies. They compared these sites to the crowded factories of Osaka and Nagoya, where workers labored with fewer machines, where resources came from distant colonies seized at great cost, where every bullet and every bomb strained the limits of supply. The reports grew thicker, the numbers larger, the conclusions darker. And still the generals dismissed them. Some argued that America's industrial power was irrelevant, that its people would never accept the cost of a long war, that a single decisive strike would force the United States to negotiate peace. Others believed that Japan's spirit, its devotion to emperor and nation, would carry it through against any odds. In truth, it was not confidence but desperation. Japan needed oil, rubber, steel. Its empire hungered for resources it did not possess. The only way forward was war, and the only enemy standing in the way was the giant across the ocean. Yet there were voices of doubt. In private, a few officers admitted what they feared. They said that the intelligence was clear, that Japan could not hope to win a war of production. They said that America's factories could build more planes in a month than Japan could in a year. They said that America's shipyards could replace a carrier faster than Japan could lay a keel. They said that in the end, no matter how many victories Japan won in the first months, the tide of steel and fire from across the Pacific would rise and consume them. But in councils of war, such words were drowned by the louder voices of ambition. And so the empire marched toward its destiny. In December 1941, Japanese aircraft swept down over Hawaii. Bombs fell, ships burned, sailors died. In Tokyo, the attack was hailed as a triumph, proof that spirit and daring could overcome size and distance. But beneath the celebration, in the minds of those who had read the reports from Detroit, a shadow lingered. They knew what would follow. They knew that in striking the giant, they had awakened it. They knew that the factories they had seen, the machines they had measured, the furnaces they had recorded, would now be turned entirely to war. The story of Japanese intelligence before Pearl Harbor is not one of failure, but of foresight. Their agents had seen the truth. They had walked through the heart of America's industrial empire and written of its power with awe and fear. They had warned their leaders. And their leaders had chosen not to listen. The illusion of spirit over matter, the hope of a short war, the belief in destiny, all proved stronger than the numbers on the page. And yet, numbers have a way of becoming reality. By the end of the war, those very statistics had become ships that crossed the ocean in convoys too vast to sink, planes that darkened the skies over Tokyo, tanks that rolled across Europe and the Pacific alike. The industrial machine that one agent had glimpsed in Detroit was unleashed in full, and its roar drowned out the empire that had dared to challenge it. But in the winter of 1940, in the half-light of the River Rouge plant, all of this was still only a possibility. The man with the notebook closed his report, pocketed his pencil and walked back into the night. Around him, the city throbbed with the pulse of industry, with the endless heartbeat of a nation that did not yet know the war it would be forced to fight. He moved quietly, blending into the streets, one small figure in the shadow of a machine that could not be stopped. What he carried with him was not a weapon, not a bomb or a gun, but a vision of the future. And though his leaders would not believe it, the truth he recorded would prove more powerful than any fleet or army. This is where the story begins, not with the clash of warships or the thunder of battle, but with the sound of machines, with the smell of steel, with the sight of fire pouring from the furnaces of a factory in Detroit. It begins with the knowledge that one empire saw what was coming and chose to look away. It begins with the silence of a spy's footsteps, and the echo of a machine that would change the fate of nations. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned clear and still over the waters of Pearl Harbor. The sailors aboard the great American battleships were just waking, some standing in line for breakfast, others preparing for a Sunday of rest. In that quiet hour, the Pacific seemed a calm frontier, a world away from the war that had already consumed Europe and Asia. But in the skies above Oahu, a wave of aircraft painted with the red sun of Japan was already descending. Engines roared, bombs fell, and the calm was shattered by fire and smoke. In Tokyo, the strike was hailed as a triumph of daring and resolve. The illusion was complete. In a single morning, the pride of the American Pacific Fleet was crippled. The generals and admirals who had long spoken of spirit over matter believed they had been proven right. Reports flooded in of battleships burning, of American sailors leaping into the sea, of chaos and panic on the docks of Pearl Harbor. The newspapers screamed of a glorious victory, a strike so bold it would force the United States to its knees. But among those who had read the intelligence reports, the celebration rang hollow. They remembered the agent who had walked through Detroit, who had measured the size of furnaces and the length of assembly lines. They remembered the numbers that spoke of oil fields and aircraft plants, of shipyards that could launch vessels at a pace Japan could never match. They remembered the warning that America was not a nation but a machine, and that the first blow would not end the war but ignite it. The gamble was clear. Japan believed that a quick, decisive war could force America to negotiate. They believed that if the empire struck fast enough, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and perhaps even threatening Australia, the United States would falter. They believed that the Americans, unaccustomed to hardship, would shrink from the cost of fighting across the Pacific. They believed that the will of the warrior would outweigh the weight of steel. And so Japan advanced. Within weeks, their armies swept through Malaya, capturing Singapore in a humiliation for the British Empire. They occupied the Philippines after brutal fighting, forcing American and Filipino soldiers on the infamous march through Bataan. They seized the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies, securing the fuel their empire desperately needed. Everywhere the rising sun flag appeared, it seemed as though Japan had proven its leaders right. The empire's reach stretched farther than ever before, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of New Guinea, from the shores of China to the coral atolls of the Pacific. But even as Japan celebrated, the numbers were changing. In 1942, American factories turned out over 47,000 aircraft. By the end of the year, they were producing more tanks than Japan would build in the entire war. Shipyards launched destroyers, carriers, and submarines in numbers that defied comprehension. The giant that Japanese intelligence had described was awakening, and with each passing month, it gathered momentum. Yet in Tokyo there was still faith in the plan. They believed that American spirit would falter once the first wave of defeat settled in. They believed that a society of consumers and merchants could not endure the long sacrifice of war. They believed that a quick string of victories would force the White House to the table. But the opposite occurred. At Pearl Harbor, amid the smoking wrecks of battleships, the American people had been unified. The strike that was meant to cripple their will had hardened it instead. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt spoke to Congress of a day that would live in infamy. His words carried across the radio waves to millions of American homes, and behind those words stood the power that the Japanese agent had once recorded. The nation, once hesitant, now mobilized with a speed that stunned even its own leaders. Civilians volunteered in droves, young men lined up at recruitment offices, women filled the factories that once built cars and now built bombers. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a phrase. It was a reality. By the middle of 1942, the illusion of a quick victory began to crack. The Battle of the Coral Sea slowed Japan's advance. At Midway, American carriers struck back, sinking 4 of Japan's most powerful vessels in a single battle. The empire that had seemed invincible in its first months of war suddenly found itself on the defensive. The loss of those carriers was not just a tactical defeat. It was a wound that Japan could not heal. For while America could build replacements in a matter of months, Japan needed years. The imbalance of production foreseen in those early intelligence reports had become reality on the waves of the Pacific. On the home front, American factories thundered day and night. In Willow Run, Michigan, a plant designed by the Ford Motor Company began producing a bomber an hour. In California, shipyards turned out Liberty ships so quickly that a single vessel could be completed in under 2 weeks. The sheer scale of production was beyond anything Japan had imagined possible. Every plane lost, every ship sunk, every tank destroyed could be replaced many times over. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and skill, but courage could not replace carriers and skill could not refill empty oil tanks. Their empire stretched thin, its resources strained to breaking, its armies fighting on too many fronts. The illusion of spirit over matter was being tested, and matter was winning. Yet still Japan fought on. The code of Bushido demanded sacrifice, demanded resistance, demanded that the empire prove itself against impossible odds. To admit that the war could not be won was unthinkable. And so, while intelligence had revealed the truth before the first bomb had fallen on Pearl Harbor, the empire marched deeper into the storm it could not control. The voices of doubt remained quiet, drowned by the drums of war. But in their silence lay a recognition that could not be spoken aloud, that America's industrial machine was too vast, too relentless, too powerful to be defeated. That every victory Japan won would be temporary, every conquest fleeting, every triumph a prelude to inevitable defeat. The storm had begun and it would only grow. By the summer of 1942, the illusion of Japanese invincibility had begun to crack, though the empire still stretched across half the Pacific. From the jungles of Burma to the scattered islands of Micronesia, Japanese banners waved in the humid air, and the commanders of the Imperial Army believed they still held the initiative. Yet the deeper truth, the one their own intelligence had laid before them even before Pearl Harbor, was slowly emerging. They were fighting not against a single enemy, but against an entire system, a machine of production and supply that reached across a continent and was now turning its full weight toward war. For America, the first year after Pearl Harbor was a year of transformation. What had once been an uneasy neutrality hardened into total mobilization. Factories that had built automobiles were now producing tanks and jeeps in endless rows. Aircraft plants expanded at a pace that astonished even their engineers, with new wings and fuselages rolling down assembly lines once designed for passenger planes. In the shipyards of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, men and women worked around the clock, launching Liberty ships in numbers so great that losses at sea no longer crippled supply. For every ship sunk by Japanese or German submarines, 2 more seemed to rise from the docks, ready to sail. This was not merely industry. It was ideology in steel. In Washington, President Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, and the phrase was more than rhetoric. It was a recognition that America's true weapon lay not in its existing fleet or its standing army, but in its capacity to create. In the fields of Iowa and Kansas, farmers produced enough grain to feed their people and supply allies abroad. In the oil fields of Texas and California, crude flowed in such abundance that America became the lifeline of energy for the Allied cause. Coal and iron streamed from the heart of the continent, feeding furnaces that never went cold. The system was total and it was relentless. For Japan, the contrast grew sharper with each passing month. The empire's conquest had secured new resources, but they came at a cost. Oil from the Dutch East Indies required long, vulnerable supply lines. Rubber from Malaya and tin from Burma strained the capacity of merchant fleets already under attack. Factories in Japan struggled to keep up with demand, their workers exhausted, their equipment pushed beyond its limits. Every ship built was a labor of years, every aircraft a treasure too costly to lose. The reports from the intelligence officers who had once walked through American factories echoed like ghosts. This is a war that cannot be won by spirit alone. And yet, spirit was all the leadership could offer. In Tokyo, speeches proclaimed the indomitable will of the Japanese soldier. Newspapers carried stories of heroic sacrifice, of men who fought to the death rather than surrender. The Bushido Code was invoked again and again, the ancient creed of the samurai remade into the fuel of modern war. Sacrifice became policy. To die for the emperor was the highest duty, to endure hunger and hardship was proof of loyalty. Against the growing tide of American steel, Japan offered blood and fire. In the Solomon Islands, this clash of matter and spirit became brutally clear. On the jungle-covered island of Guadalcanal, American Marines landed in August 1942, seeking to seize an airfield under construction by Japanese forces. The battle that followed dragged on for months, through torrential rains and nights filled with sudden attacks. Japanese soldiers fought with ferocity, launching wave after wave of assaults, often charging into machine gun fire with bayonets fixed, shouting the emperor's name. The Americans held, supplied by convoys that stretched across the ocean, supported by factories that replaced losses almost as quickly as they occurred. For Japan, Guadalcanal was a wound that never healed. Thousands of men were lost, entire units destroyed, and precious ships and aircraft wasted in desperate attempts to retake the island. Each time the empire replaced one unit, America replaced 10. Each time Japan launched an attack, American artillery, aircraft, and tanks stood ready in numbers that grew month by month. By the end of the campaign, Japan had abandoned the island, leaving behind graves in the jungle and wrecks along the shore. It was a defeat not just of arms but of systems. Spirit had collided with matter, and matter had endured. Back in the United States, the system continued to expand. Propaganda posters urged citizens to work harder, to buy war bonds, to conserve resources. And they did. Housewives collected scrap metal. Children gathered rubber. Men and women worked shifts that stretched through the night. In cities and small towns alike, the war was everywhere, in the faces of those leaving for the front and in the hands of those who stayed behind to build. The war effort was not confined to generals and soldiers. It was woven into the fabric of an entire nation. Japan watched in silence as reports came in. American aircraft production climbed from tens of thousands to nearly 100,000 per year. Ship production doubled, then tripled. The number of tanks and artillery pieces swelled beyond calculation. The empire could not hope to match these numbers, and yet it fought on, convinced that the spirit of its people would compensate. But in the back of every Japanese planner's mind lingered the words once written in those intelligence reports: "They can drown us in steel." The ideology of matter over spirit became clearer with each battle. At Midway, American factories replaced lost planes and trained new pilots in weeks. Japan's losses of experienced aviators, carefully trained over years, were irreplaceable. At Guadalcanal, America could pour supplies across the ocean, while Japan's convoys were decimated by submarines and aircraft. In the skies over New Guinea, swarms of American fighters appeared faster than they could be shot down. The machine was not only vast, it was inexhaustible. And yet, ideology can be stubborn. Japan's leaders continued to speak of honor, of sacrifice, of destiny. They told their people that victory was still possible, that America was fragile, that one decisive blow might still turn the tide. But the reality was already clear. The empire was caught in a war of attrition it could not win, against an opponent whose strength had been measured and recorded even before the first shot was fired. The intelligence had not lied. The officers who had walked through American factories, who had seen furnaces and assembly lines, had written the truth. Their words were ignored, their warnings dismissed, their clarity buried under the weight of pride. Now, in the jungles and seas of the Pacific, that truth was being written again, not on paper but in blood. By the end of 1942, the rising action of the war was no longer in Japan's favor. The empire had expanded to its greatest reach, but beyond that horizon loomed the gathering storm of American industry. Each plane that flew from an American airfield, each ship that slipped into the water from an American dock, was a reminder that the war Japan had chosen was not the war its leaders had promised. It was not a quick strike, not a short campaign, not a contest of will alone. It was a test of endurance, of resources, of systems, and it was a test Japan was already failing. The tide had begun to turn, though the battle still raged. What remained was the slow, grinding clash between an empire fueled by spirit and sacrifice, and a nation whose factories thundered with endless power. The next chapters of the war would reveal which force would prevail. By the middle of 1943, the tide of war had shifted. The Japanese Empire, once triumphant, now faced an enemy whose strength seemed to multiply with every passing season. The battles that followed revealed not only the courage of men, but the collision of two philosophies, one that placed its faith in spirit, and another that trusted in the endless capacity of machines. The intelligence reports that had warned of this imbalance before the war now seemed prophetic, their truth revealed in fire and steel. In the skies over the Pacific, American bombers flew in formations so vast that their shadows seemed to blot out the sun. Squadrons of fighters escorted them, swarms of silver wings glinting in the daylight. Every plane carried the power of factories thousands of miles away, where men and women worked day and night to replace every loss, to build not only for today but for tomorrow and the day after. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace what it lost. Its aircraft factories were limited, its resources dwindling. Pilots trained for years were killed in months, their absence leaving gaps that could never be filled. On the seas, the difference was even more stark. The Battle of Midway had already crippled the Japanese carrier fleet. Now, new American carriers rolled from shipyards at a pace that defied belief. For every Japanese vessel launched, 3 or 4 American ships appeared. For every submarine lost, another took its place, built in steel foundries that poured out hulls as if they were toys. The once feared Japanese Navy found itself stretched thin, forced into defensive battles it could no longer afford to fight. In the jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japanese soldiers clung to ridges and caves, fighting with ferocity, enduring hunger and disease. Their courage was undeniable, their loyalty to emperor and nation unshaken. Yet courage could not conjure food from barren soil, nor bullets from empty crates. American forces, supplied by convoys that spanned the ocean, carried with them an abundance that seemed almost unreal: crates of rations, weapons in endless supply, medical equipment, fuel, ammunition. The Japanese soldiers who captured a single American camp marveled at the wealth left behind, at the piles of food, at the ammunition belts stacked high, at the radios and vehicles and comforts their own armies lacked. Back in Japan, the government pressed its people harder. Factories demanded longer hours. Food grew scarce. Rice, once a staple, became a luxury. Families tightened their belts, children went without, and propaganda told them to endure for the sake of victory. But the numbers told another story. America was outproducing Japan by margins so vast that no amount of sacrifice could bridge the gap. And then in 1944, the storm reached its full fury. The Mariana Islands became the focus of battle, and on the seas nearby, the clash known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot unfolded. American pilots, trained in droves and flying in machines built faster than Japan could shoot them down, slaughtered Japanese aircraft in staggering numbers. Hundreds were destroyed in a single day, the cream of Japan's remaining air power wiped away. Veterans shook their heads in despair. One commander, watching plane after plane vanish into smoke, is said to have whispered that Japan was no longer fighting men but factories. The loss of the Marianas carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. From those islands, American B-29 bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. The nightmare foreseen in the earliest intelligence reports became reality. America's industrial machine now projected its power directly onto the heart of the empire. The raids began cautiously, then grew relentless. By night and by day, formations of bombers roared across the skies of Japan. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that had once been centers of industry, were reduced to fields of ashes. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo incinerated vast swaths of the capital, leaving charred ruins where neighborhoods had once stood. Tens of thousands perished in a single night. The war was no longer distant. It had come home. For the men and women of Japan, the reality was undeniable. The empire's leaders had promised swift victory, had spoken of American weakness, had insisted that spirit would triumph. But now the truth was written in the skies, in the ashes of burned cities, in the empty shelves and hungry stomachs. America's factories had become weapons in themselves, and their output rained down from above. And yet, even in the face of devastation, Japan's leaders clung to the illusion. They spoke of decisive battles still to come, of miracle weapons, of the unbreakable will of the nation. They ordered civilians to prepare for invasion, to sharpen bamboo spears, to prepare to die in defense of the homeland. The code of sacrifice was extended to everyone, from soldiers to schoolchildren. But the imbalance had grown absolute. By 1945, America was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year. Its shipyards launched carriers and battleships at a pace no other nation could match. Its tanks rolled off assembly lines in endless rows, ready to fight in Europe and the Pacific at once. The arsenal of democracy had become more than a phrase, it was the decisive weapon of the age. The climax of this war of systems was not a single battle, but the relentless collapse of Japan's capacity to resist. With every passing month, its defenses crumbled further, its armies weakened, its navy shattered, its cities burned. The warnings that had once been written in quiet reports by anonymous agents now rang out in every corner of the empire. The war had never been about spirit alone. It had always been about matter, about resources, about the ability to endure. And so, as American forces closed in on the home islands, as bombers reduced cities to rubble and the fleet ringed the empire with steel, the truth became undeniable. Japan had struck first, but it had struck a giant. It had gambled that the machine could be beaten by courage, and it had lost. The collapse was not sudden, not a single moment of defeat, but a long, grinding surrender to the sheer weight of production and supply. The truth revealed by intelligence before the war had become reality in its most terrible form. The empire was broken not by the loss of spirit, but by the triumph of industry. By the summer of 1945, the empire that had once stretched across Asia and the Pacific was cornered. Its navy lay at the bottom of the ocean, its air force scattered and broken, its armies isolated on islands they could no longer defend. The great gamble of Pearl Harbor, the dream of a swift and decisive victory, had dissolved into the reality that intelligence had whispered years earlier. America's industrial power was beyond challenge, its ability to produce war without end unmatched in history. The firebombing of Tokyo had reduced the capital to ashes. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all had suffered the same fate. Cities that had once symbolized Japan's modern progress were blackened ruins, their streets littered with the remnants of lives consumed by flame. For civilians, the war was no longer a distant thunder but an inescapable presence. Hunger gnawed at families. Children dug for roots in the countryside while mothers waited in line for scraps of rice. The empire had asked for sacrifice, and its people had given everything they could. But sacrifice could not refill oil tanks, could not rebuild factories, could not replace fleets of carriers and wings of bombers. The truth that intelligence had recorded in Detroit before the war had become a daily reality. America could build more in a week than Japan could in a year. Every plane shot down over Okinawa was replaced before the wreckage hit the sea. Every ship damaged at Iwo Jima was repaired or replaced in days. Japan's soldiers still fought with valor, still launched desperate attacks, still believed in the code of honor that had carried them so far. But valor could not outweigh steel, and honor could not match the momentum of a machine that spanned a continent. The invasion of Okinawa revealed the depth of the empire's desperation. Thousands of men launched suicide missions and aircraft turned into flying bombs. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves against American ships, hoping that sacrifice could succeed where weapons had failed. They sank vessels, they killed sailors, they inflicted fear, but the machine absorbed the blows. New ships arrived. New men stepped forward. For every life Japan gave, America's factories responded with more steel, more engines, more guns. The arithmetic of war was merciless, and in that arithmetic Japan had no answer. By July 1945, American bombers flew unopposed over the home islands. The empire's leaders still spoke of resistance, of a decisive battle yet to come, of civilians armed with bamboo spears fighting invaders on the beaches. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. In the quiet offices of Tokyo, some remembered the reports they had once dismissed. They remembered the agent who had walked through the River Rouge plant, who had written that America was not a nation but a machine. They remembered the numbers, the tonnage of steel, the output of factories, the flow of oil. They remembered, and they knew that the war had always been lost even before it began. And then in August came the final blow. A single bomber appeared over Hiroshima and released a weapon unlike any the world had seen. In seconds, a city vanished in light and fire. Days later, another city, Nagasaki, suffered the same fate. The bombs were not merely weapons of destruction. They were the culmination of the same industrial and scientific power that intelligence had warned of. The Manhattan Project, hidden and vast, had employed thousands, consumed resources beyond imagination, and delivered a force so great it ended the war at a stroke. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice reached his people over the radio. In solemn tones he announced surrender. For the first time in their history, the Japanese people heard their divine sovereign speak directly to them. His words carried sorrow but also inevitability. The war had ended not in victory, not in glory, but in ruin. The empire that had gambled against the machine had been crushed beneath it. In the aftermath, cities lay in rubble. Millions were displaced. Families mourned sons who would never return. The once proud fleet was gone, the air force annihilated, the factories silent. The land was scarred and so were its people. Yet amid the devastation, one truth lingered, the truth carried years earlier in the notebook of an anonymous spy. Industrial power is destiny in the age of total war. Spirit alone cannot prevail when the world has been remade into an engine of production. The occupation that followed brought new realities. American soldiers walked the streets of Tokyo, their uniforms a daily reminder of defeat. But they also brought food, medicine, reconstruction. The machine that had destroyed now turned to rebuild. Where bombs had fallen, supplies now arrived. Where factories had been shattered, new industries began to grow. The nation that had been overwhelmed by American power would, in time, rise again with American aid. The irony was inescapable. The very machine that had crushed Japan would help remake it into a new kind of power. For historians the lesson was clear. The Second World War was not won by courage alone, nor lost by cowardice. It was a war decided by resources, by systems, by the ability to produce and sustain. The Japanese intelligence officers who had walked through America's factories had seen the truth clearly. They had written it in reports, carried it across oceans, placed it before their leaders. They had warned that the war was unwinnable, that America's strength was immeasurable, that the machine could not be challenged. But the truth was too heavy, too stark, too frightening to be accepted. Pride and ambition demanded otherwise. And so the warnings were ignored and the empire was led into catastrophe. When we look back, we see not only battles and dates but the deeper struggle of ideas. Japan believed that spirit could triumph over matter, that courage could overcome machinery, that sacrifice could substitute for resources. America believed that matter, organized and mobilized, would inevitably prevail. In the end, the war proved that spirit alone cannot resist the weight of an industrial age. The clash was not merely between armies and fleets, but between illusions and realities. Today the ruins have been rebuilt. The cities that once lay in ashes now stand tall, filled with lights and life. Japan became a nation of industry itself, learning from the very system it once sought to defeat. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh no longer thunder as they once did, but their echo remains in history, a reminder of the moment when machines shaped the fate of nations. The story began in silence, with a man walking through a factory in Detroit, recording what he saw. It ended with silence, too, the silence that followed surrender, the silence of a world that had witnessed destruction beyond imagination. Between those silences stretched a war that consumed millions of lives, a war that proved the prophecy of steel. The agent who once wrote in his notebook is forgotten now, his name lost, his words buried in archives. But the truth he saw remains. In the age of total war, numbers are destiny. In the clash between spirit and system, system endures. And in the quiet after the storm, one lesson lingers above all others. To deny the weight of reality is to invite destruction, and history does not forgive illusions.